song.
How did you get to meet Rick James?
He came to the studio. He just came to the studio where I was working at.
Did you almost have a baby again? Because I would.
Hell no. I want to touch with that with your stuff.
Relax.
I think what you mean is Rick James, James Johnson. My real name is James.
Right.
Johnson.
Yeah.
Rick James is my stage name. I was a little apprehensive, you know. I was a little.
Chaka Khan has named the 8 gay singers Rick James dated in secret. From Neil Young in Toronto's underground scene.
Rick was, he was great when I was playing with him. I'd like to play with him again sometime, actually.
To Marvin Gaye in Motown's golden era.
The only thing that I like, Sexual Healing by Marvin Gaye.
Then there was Eddie Murphy, at the height of his 1980s superstardom.
Did you at one time get snowed in at Rick James's house in Buffalo?
Yes.
And how long were you there?
We were snowed in for 2 weeks. We were supposed to go up for the weekend.
Rick James built an empire on sexual freedom. But the relationships that defined him were the ones he could never acknowledge in public. The connections that would have ended his career the moment anyone said the truth out loud. So, let's get into it. Toronto in the late 1960s was a breeding ground for musical revolution. The Mynah Birds were making noise in the underground scene, and 2 young musicians were living together in a cramped apartment, sharing more than just rent money.
I'm gonna show that little heart of yours that I'm the one you've been.
Rick James and Neil Young weren't just bandmates. They were inseparable during those formative years, spending days writing music and nights exploring the boundaries of their friendship. The Mynah Birds had something special. James brought the soul and funk sensibilities from his Detroit roots, while Young contributed his folk rock edge. Their chemistry on stage was undeniable, but what happened offstage became the subject of quiet speculation among other musicians in the Toronto circuit. They shared clothes, shared meals, shared dreams of making it big. In the cramped quarters of their shared living space, boundaries blurred in ways that neither would ever publicly acknowledge. James was running from the Navy at the time, using Toronto as his sanctuary. Young was trying to escape his own demons, finding solace in the company of someone who understood the artist's struggle.
Rick was, he was great when I was playing with him. I'd like to play with him again sometime, actually.
They would stay up until dawn, guitars in hand, creating music that would never see the light of day. Those sessions were intimate in ways that transcended typical musical collaboration. When James got arrested for going AWOL from the Navy, the Mynah Birds fell apart. Young went on to become a rock legend. James got sent back to military prison. But those months living together in Toronto created a bond that neither could fully explain to outsiders. Years later, when both had achieved fame, they rarely spoke about that period. Young would deflect questions about the Mynah Birds, focusing instead on Buffalo Springfield and his solo work. James would mention it in passing, always keeping the details vague, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid uncomfortable questions.
He was like so rambunctious. He was so happy to be playing this music, you know, with this group. And I mean, he was excited about it because it was like a group, you know, it was great. And he hadn't done that.
The music scene in Toronto was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but some secrets were kept. Other musicians from that era would later hint at the unusually close nature of James and Young's relationship, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it outright. In an industry already hostile to anyone who didn't fit the heterosexual mold, discretion wasn't just preferred, it was survival. Joni Mitchell was already establishing herself as Toronto's queen of folk music when Rick James entered her orbit. She was older, more experienced, already building the reputation that would make her a legend.
Oh, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. They pay paradise, put up a
James was still rough around the edges, still figuring out who he was as an artist and as a person. Mitchell saw something in him that others missed. They would meet at her apartment after her club performances, sometimes not leaving until the sun came up. Mitchell would play her latest compositions on guitar, and James would share stories about growing up in Buffalo, about the music that shaped him, about the dreams he was afraid to speak out loud. She introduced him to jazz records that would fundamentally alter his musical direction. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, the sounds that would later influence his own funk innovations.
When I was 7, I took piano lessons, mainly because I had this urge to write music. And recently I found an old scribbler that I had written primitively. I'd written out left and right hand piano for a song called Robin Walk. So I guess I wrote my first song instrumental at 7 and a half.
But their connection went beyond music appreciation. Mitchell was known for her intense, consuming relationships with other artists. She poured herself into the people she cared about, and James became one of her projects. She saw his potential before he saw it himself, pushed him to dig deeper, to be more vulnerable in his songwriting. Those all-night sessions weren't just about listening to records. They were about two artists stripping away their defenses, sharing parts of themselves they kept hidden from the world. Mitchell's apartment became a safe space for James during his Toronto years. She didn't judge his complications, didn't press him about the Navy situation, didn't ask questions about the things he chose not to share. In her presence, he could explore different versions of himself without fear of rejection. She understood what it meant to be an artist who didn't fit conventional molds, who needed freedom to become fully realized. The nature of their relationship remained ambiguous by design. Mitchell would later write songs that some believe referenced James, coded messages about a complicated connection that defied easy categorization. James would speak of her with reverence, calling her one of the most important people in his artistic development, but always maintaining a careful distance when describing exactly what they meant to each other. When James finally left Toronto, Mitchell was one of the few people he stayed in contact with. They would reconnect over the years, their bond enduring even as their careers took them in different directions. She watched him transform into Rick James the superstar, the super freak, the leather-clad funk god. But she remembered the vulnerable young man who sat on her floor listening to jazz records, the version of Rick James that the world would never get to see. Marvin Gaye was everything Rick James wanted to become. Smooth, sophisticated, sexually magnetic, a Motown legend who commanded respect. When James finally signed with Motown in the late 1970s, being in the same building as Gaye felt like validation. Proof that he'd finally made it to the level where legends operated. James was a fan before he ever became a colleague. He'd grown up listening to Gaye's voice, studying his stage presence, trying to decode what made him so magnetic. The Motown studios became a place where James might catch glimpses of Gaye in hallways, in the cafeteria, in parking lots. Each sighting felt significant, like being in proximity to greatness.
The only thing that I like, Sexual Healing by Marvin Gaye.
They existed in the same circles without ever really connecting. James would see Gaye at label events, at industry parties, at recording sessions happening in adjacent studios. He'd watch how Gaye carried himself, how other artists treated him with reverence, how he seemed untouchable even when he was falling apart. But Gaye was dealing with his own demons during this period. His marriage was crumbling. His relationship with Motown was toxic, and he was struggling with depression that made him withdraw from everyone.
In fact, the last 7 years of my life haven't been exactly ecstatic for me. I haven't been ecstatic. I've been happy and somewhat, most of the time, pretty depressed.
James would see him looking haunted in the Motown hallways, would hear stories about erratic behavior, about the smooth legend coming undone in real time. James wanted to say something, wanted to reach out, wanted to bridge the gap between fan and peer. But Gaye's energy didn't invite approach. He moved through spaces like he was already gone, like he'd checked out of the present moment and was living somewhere else entirely. James recognized that look because he'd worn it himself during dark periods.
Love is misery. Love is miserable. I think I'll be a bachelor and I'll swing and I won't fall in love. I'll just be loveful, be kind.
The distance between them remained absolute, They were label mates who never collaborated, admirers who never became friends, two men dealing with similar demons in completely separate orbits. James would mention Gaye in interviews, positioning him as the standard of excellence, but they never had conversations deep enough to justify the reverence. When Gaye left Motown and moved to Europe, James felt the absence. The hallways seemed emptier, without even the possibility of running into him. The label felt less legitimate without its biggest star walking the floors. James was ascending while Gaye was disappearing, their trajectories crossing without ever touching. Gaye's death in 1984 hit James in unexpected ways, not because they'd been close, but because Gaye represented what James feared most about fame.
Good evening. Police in Los Angeles say soul singer Marvin Gaye has been shot to death, and his father, a minister, Marvin Gaye Sr., has been taken into custody.
The isolation, the inability to escape your own head, the way success could trap you in a persona that no longer fit. James saw his own possible future in Gaye's tragic ending, and it terrified him more than he could admit. Eddie Murphy was the hottest comedian in America when he met Rick James in 1981. Young, fearless, printing money for Paramount Pictures. Murphy was the kind of star who could have anyone he wanted, but he kept gravitating back to James, showing up at his parties, inviting him to movie sets, creating a friendship that raised eyebrows among their respective entourages. James saw something familiar in Murphy's energy. The young comedian had that same hunger, that same need to push boundaries and shock audiences. Murphy was playing with gender and sexuality in his comedy routines, testing how far he could go before the audience pushed back. James recognized that dance, that careful navigation of identity in the public eye. They would disappear together for days, holed up in James's mansion or Murphy's Hollywood Hills house.
Did you at one time get snowed in at Rick James's house in Buffalo?
Yes.
And how long were you there?
We were snowed in for 2 weeks. We were supposed to go up for the week.
The parties were legendary, but what happened after the parties ended became the subject of intense speculation. James's influence on Murphy during this period was undeniable. Murphy started dressing differently, acting differently, pushing his comedy into more provocative territory. James was teaching Murphy how to be a superstar, but he was also sharing the darker parts of fame. The cocaine, the paranoia, the constant pressure to maintain an image that might not match reality. Murphy was young enough to think he could handle it all, old enough to know he was in dangerous territory. Their friendship became so close that it made both of their teams nervous. Murphy's management worried that James's reputation would damage the comedian's family-friendly image. James's people worried that he was becoming too attached, too dependent on Murphy's validation. But neither man seemed willing to create distance. The nature of their relationship shifted the longer it went on. What started as mentorship evolved into something more complicated, more intense.
Yeah, I remember grinding my feet in Eddie's couch.
You remember why you did it?
Because Eddie could buy another one. Fuck your couch, nigga. Buy another one, you rich motherfucker.
They developed private jokes, shared references that no one else understood. When they were together, they created their own world with its own rules, away from the demands of their public lives. Murphy would later distance himself from James as his own career exploded even further. The Eddie Murphy of the late 1980s and 1990s couldn't afford to be associated with someone as controversial as Rick James had become. But during those early years, during the formation of Murphy's superstar persona, James was there, shaping him, influencing him, connecting with him in ways that neither would ever fully acknowledge. Debbie Allen was already a Broadway star when Rick James entered her world. Sophisticated, talented, respected, she represented everything James pretended not to want. She was establishment, where he was rebellious, disciplined, where he was chaotic, but she saw through his performance. recognized the scared kid underneath the super freak persona. Alan invited James to see her in a Broadway show, probably hoping to expose him to a different kind of artistry, to remind him there was more to entertainment than sex and drugs and funk music. James showed up high, exhausted from whatever he'd been doing the night before. He fell asleep during the performance, his head nodding while Alan commanded the stage. After the show, Alan confronted him, not with anger, but with concern that cut deeper than criticism. She saw where he was heading, recognized the self-destructive patterns that would eventually consume him. James didn't know how to respond to genuine care from someone who wanted nothing from him except his survival.
I was calling action, cut. Oh, he learned his lesson. I did not wait for anybody's trial or go to court. I straightened his ass out right then.
Their relationship developed into something unexpected. Alan became a safe harbor, someone who knew the real Rick James underneath the costume. She would call him in the middle of the night when she was worried, showing up at his house to check on him when he went silent for too long. James started confiding in her, sharing fears and insecurities he kept hidden from everyone else. Alan understood the pressure of being a black artist trying to succeed in industries that didn't want to make space for them. She recognized the toll it took, the ways it forced people to compromise or break. James was breaking, and she was trying to hold the pieces together long enough for him to save himself. The intimacy of their friendship created rumors that neither addressed. People assumed they were sleeping together because that was the only framework they had for understanding a close relationship between a man and a woman. But what they shared was more complicated than romance, more sustaining than sex. Alan represented the path James didn't take. The version of himself that chose discipline over chaos, artistry over excess. When she looked at him, she saw wasted potential, a brilliant artist destroying himself. When he looked at her, he saw judgment that felt like love, concern that made him uncomfortable because it was real. Tina Marie showed up at Motown as a white girl trying to sing black music, and everyone expected her to fail. Rick James saw something else. He saw a kindred spirit, someone who didn't fit the boxes, someone who understood what it meant to be fundamentally out of place. He produced her first album, spending more time in the studio with her than anyone thought necessary. James was meticulous in ways he rarely was with his own music, carefully crafting Tina Marie's sound, shaping her image, creating her career. She called him her mentor, but their relationship became something much more complicated.
You were cold as ice long ago.
They would spend entire days together, working on music, talking about life, existing in a creative bubble that excluded the outside world. James was teaching her how to navigate the music industry as someone who didn't fit expectations, sharing lessons he'd learned through painful experience. Marie was absorbing everything, becoming the artist he believed she could be. At some point, they got engaged. The engagement lasted 2 weeks before they both realized marriage wasn't what they needed from each other. But those 2 weeks revealed something important about their connection. It wasn't conventional romance, wasn't typical passion. It was something harder to define. A merging of artistic souls that occasionally crossed into physical territory. Marie understood parts of James that his other partners couldn't access. She saw his vulnerability, his insecurity, his fear of abandonment. James trusted her with his music in ways he trusted almost no one else, letting her into his creative process, sharing ideas before they were fully formed.
But the world would come to know him as Rick James. And his musical genius and slick sense of style would one day define a quantum moment in
Their professional collaborations produced some of James's best work, but the personal toll was significant. Marie became dependent on his approval, shaped her identity around his vision of who she should be. James became possessive, uncomfortable when she started developing her own career independent of his influence. The boundaries between mentor and lover, between friend and partner, between creative collaboration and codependency became increasingly blurred. They would fight and reconcile, separate and come back together, unable to fully commit or fully separate. Other people in their lives became jealous of their connection, sensing that no one else would ever fully understand what they meant to each other. Linda Blair was famous for playing a possessed child, but she had grown into a woman trying to escape that image when she met Rick James in 1982. He was at the height of his fame, the Super Freak era making him one of the biggest stars in music. She was trying to be taken seriously as an adult actress. They found each other at the intersection of fame and desperation.
Rick James was as big a talent as we have ever known. He was admired from one end of the planet to the other.
James fell in love in the obsessive way he did everything else. Blair represented something he'd been chasing, a kind of legitimacy, a connection to Hollywood glamour. He wrote about her in his memoir with unusual honesty, admitting that he loved her, that her decision to have an abortion without telling him first broke something inside him. The abortion became a turning point. James felt betrayed. Felt like Blair had made a unilateral decision about something that involved both of them. But beneath the anger was a deeper hurt. The abortion represented Blair's ultimate rejection, her unwillingness to be tied to him permanently, to commit to the complicated reality of who he was. Their relationship was public in ways most of James's connections weren't. They showed up to events together, got photographed by paparazzi, played the Hollywood couple game. But the public version was sanitized, carefully managed to protect both of their images. Behind closed doors, things were more volatile, more intense, more destructive. Blair left him in 1984, ending a relationship that had consumed both of them. James spiraled harder after she left, the cocaine use intensifying, the paranoia growing, the grip on reality loosening. He would later describe the Blair years as both the best and worst of his life, unable to reconcile the love and the damage. Then came Tanya Hijazi in the early 1990s. James was already falling apart. The drugs and the paranoia and the accumulated trauma of decades in the industry finally catching up. Hijazi entered his life at the worst possible moment, when he needed saving but was too far gone to be saved. The 1993 kidnapping and torture case destroyed what was left of James's reputation. The details were horrific, the kind of allegations that end careers and lives. James and Hijazi were both arrested, both eventually convicted, both sent to prison. The intense media coverage turned James from a beloved funk legend into a monster, his past achievements overshadowed by present horrors. The case revealed the culmination of decades of untreated trauma, unaddressed addiction, and identity confusion that James had been managing through increasingly destructive behavior. The relationships that should have helped him became sites of mutual destruction. The love he sought became obsession that hurt everyone involved. Prison gave James time to think about the choices he'd made, the people he'd hurt, the life he'd wasted. But it couldn't undo the damage, couldn't restore the career, couldn't bring back the people he'd lost along the way. When he got out, he was a broken version of himself, the super freak reduced to a cautionary tale. The 8 people who had known different versions of Rick James watched his fall from various distances. Some tried to help, some walked away, some pretended they'd never been close. But they all carried pieces of the truth about who he really was, what he really needed, what he was really running from his entire life. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye!